we're going to talk more about dinosaurs and such, because what I find is when I get questions about creation, and I know this sounds strange to people, I'm sure, but in my line of work, I run across a lot of people, and I actually get questions about what I think about creation fairly often when people find out I'm a Christian doctor, because doctors are scientists. To one degree or another, depending on how you think about it. There are more virologists in the world today than there have ever been because of COVID, but a lot of doctors still do, since all your neighbors are virologists and such. But since doctors are scientists at heart, I do have a degree in biochemistry, for instance, and so we think about things from a science standpoint, and what that means is we like evidence. We like to find things that correlate to a findable, then reproducible circumstance that suggests information can be gleaned from it. And so when I see patients, they often tend to ask me, what do you think about creation or literal Bible interpretation or the flood or even the crossing of the Red Sea, the plagues, the resurrection of Jesus, resurrection of Lazarus. That I tend to get those questions. And of interest, when I start to mention, I believe that God created the earth just as he says in the Bible. One of the things that almost always is brought up to me is, but what do you think about, how do you account for the dinosaurs? And, how can we look at that and see literal creation? So that's what I want to address today. And I think there are a lot of things that are interesting aspects of that. I can tell you, I don't think we have the complete total answer on any of this stuff, because I wasn't a personal witness to, for instance, the flood, though I look like I could have been, but I was not, alas. So we'll start though first with today's trivia question is, what was Joseph's name in Egypt? That yeah, it's long. The answer is it's that long. That is true. If only we spelled it like that. So but what was Joseph's name in Egypt? That's the trivia question. And then, so I think it's of interest, as I've mentioned before, there's never, well, maybe I shouldn't say never, because somebody could pick apart that statement probably. What I find though, is that in general, it is amazing how much documented history we have in the Bible that often has bits and pieces outside the Bible that can correlate also and provide evidence of that. But we have more detail in the Bible than in any other history-oriented book or stored set of knowledge anywhere. And the Bible is amazing how it's been preserved over time, how it's consistent, how you can document findings that prove truth. And one of the, there's a lot of Egyptian history, but I think we have as much or maybe more Egyptian history in the Bible than what they can readily account for in their society. And part of that reason, which I think is the genius of the way God presents information to us, preserves information to us, is that when a nation is overthrown by someone, it was a standard practice back in the past, as we are seeing today in Afghanistan and the Taliban retaking the country and such. They go in and wipe out the history that has been present before, so that when, say, a new line of pharaohs would come into power in Egypt, they would go back and obliterate the history of the prior pharaohs. We have more information, again, I think in scripture than sometimes is found in, depending on the line of pharaohs, in Egypt. And it's just, to me, a fascinating thing. That's enough on that to give you time to find trivia question answer. Yes. Yes, Zaphanath Paneah, thank you. That is that long. Exactly that long. So this is Genesis 41:44. I'll back up, of course, to 41. Genesis 41 squared, 41 all. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. This was, of course, after that he had prophesied about from the dreams of Pharaoh about the impending famine and the need to store food and all that. He dressed them in robes of fine linen. This is now down to 41, 42. Put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command. Men shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one would lift a hand or foot in all of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, a priest of On, to be his wife. Joseph went through the land of Egypt. So the downside was he had to marry into the arranged marriage with the false god prophet, but he was in command, second in command in Egypt. So fascinating bit of history there. I do, because I have a footnote. I don't remember. It means, let's see. Well, wait. Somebody took my footnote. Revealer of secret things. Yes, thank you. I know I have that here somewhere. Revealer of secret things. Very interesting. And then Asenath means belongs to the goddess Neith, who was also one of the false gods of Egypt. And then Potiphar, just of interest, is not the same as Potiphar, whose household Joseph worked in, just so you know. All right, so we're going to look at what my theory, and I want to emphasize again, just for the sake of making sure it's been emphasized enough, this is my theory on dinosaurs and creation. If you agree, then that's fine. If you don't agree, that's fine. But this is my opportunity to present you my theory. And so I'm going to take that chance and this class time, because I think it is important. Just like I get asked what about the dinosaurs in terms of God's creation, I think you might get that question sometimes. And I think it's a very fair and reasonable thing for us to look at. So I'm going to have us go back to Genesis 1 for just a moment. And I want us to look at verse 20. God said, Genesis 1:20, God said, let the water teem with living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas. Let the birds increase on the earth. There is evening, there is morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. So I just want to reestablish that God made every living creature, sea, air, land, plant. I didn't reread the plants, but every living thing God made. Okay, let's now look for a moment, because I think it is of interest. Let's go back over to Job. And we'll look at Job 3. Last time we were talking about Job, we were talking about chapters 1 and 2. Let's go to Job 3. All right, so this was after Job had been hit with 2 plague issues by Satan. And so I'll start verse 1. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, may the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said a boy is born. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. That night may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered in any of the months. So Job was very upset, very depressed. That's a different lesson. Verse 7, may that night be barren, make no shout of joy, may no shout of joy be heard in it. May those who curse days Curse that day, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. What or who is Leviathan is what we'll talk about for a minute. So he was so upset, he wanted that the consideration to rouse Leviathan. So I'm going to have us turn for a moment to a couple other passages that are similar. Let's look at Job 48. I'm sorry, not 48. Job 41, excuse me. Job 41. There is no Job 48, and I'm not adding scripture this morning. All right, so that's been my goal today and every day. All right, Job 41. Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fish hook? This first one. Or tie down its tongue with a rope. Okay, bear with me. We have enough time. I'm going to read a few verses here. Can you put a cord through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he keep begging for mercy? Will he speak to you with gentle words? Will he make an agreement with you for you to take him as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of him like a bird or put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders barter for him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his hide with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on him, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing is false. The mere sight of him is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse him. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me. I will not fail to speak of his limbs, his strength, his graceful form. Who can strip off his outer coat? Who would approach him with a bridle? Who dares open the doors of his mouth, ringed about with his fearsome teeth? His back has rows of shields tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between them. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. His snorting throws out flashes of light. His eyes are like rays of dawn. Firebrands stream from his mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from his nostrils. And as from a boiling pot over a fire breeds, his breath sets coals ablaze. Flames dart from his mouth. Strength resides in his neck. Dismay goes before him. The folds of his flesh are tightly joined. They are firm and immovable. His chest is hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When he rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before his thrashing. The sword that reaches him has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. Iron he treats like straw, bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make him flee. Slingstones are like chaff to him. A club seems to him but a piece of straw. He laughs at the rattling of the lance. His undersides are jagged potsherds, leaving a trail of mud like threshing sledge. He makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron. He stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. Behind him, where he leaves a glistening wake, one would think that the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is his equal, a creature without fear. He looks down on all that are haughty. He is king over all that are proud. Now, think about what I just read and think about what does that make you think of? The what? Dinosaur, yes. And maybe a dragon, maybe anything else? Maybe Satan. Okay, that's a very fair one. Maybe some beasts that we just don't know about, right? That's the other one I'd add. But I would say, thinking about, like shields of armor along the back, skin that's hard as rock, no gaps in it. Those are things that we view like dinosaurs, certainly, and like the powerful creatures that we perceive them to be. And then when you start talking about snorting out fire and burning things like coals, being able to snap things like a club snaps like what did Job call it? A toothpick? Well, like wood, or easy to snap a club and things, the weapons of the day, and the javelins and it sounds like you could use multiple weapons, spears, whatever, and not bring down this beast. And so it's interesting that I think this is such a vivid description.
Can you also talk about
yes,
which would be like giant elephants?
Maybe. And I'll tell you about that here in a second. We'll actually turn to that here in just a minute. Her question is about behemoths maybe being like giant elephants. Some people think like mastodon. What's the other word for mastodon? All of a sudden, woolly mammoth. Yes, thank you, woolly mammoth. I couldn't think of the word all of a sudden. But yeah, behemoth is close. So keep a finger at Job 41 while we look over. Going to have you turn to Psalm as soon as I remember the verse. Psalm. Oh, good grief! Which one? I got it. There are only 150 to choose from. I'm going to pick the right one. We really hope. That is a great thing to have hope about, by the way. So let's see. We'll look at, I've got to cross-reference it. Is it 46, 48? All right, somebody's going to find that for us in a minute. In the meantime, I'll have us turn instead to Isaiah 47 for now. Let's look at Isaiah 27, excuse me. Isaiah 27. Leviathan. Yeah, thank you. There's an entry in Psalm on it that I am just drawing a blank on off my game day. It's the fault of the Isaiah 27:1. It's the fault of the what's the guy think of that name too? Benevolence Committee. I had benevolence retreat this weekend. So you never know how bad things can get memory wise. All right, so the Isaiah 27:1. In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent. Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. Boy, does that make much sense to us? Man, that's a hard passage. Think about that. The gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea. All right, and we got to find the Psalm one.
Psalm 74:14.
Thank you.
Psalm 104:26.
Thank you. Psalm 74:14, then 104:26. 74:14. Yes, this is it. Thank you. I'm going to back up in 74. I'm actually going to start verse 1, read a few choice verses. Psalm 74:1. Why have you rejected us forever, O God? Why is your anger smolder against the sheep of your pasture? Then let's go down to verse 4. Your foes roared in a place where they met with us. They set up their standards as signs. They behaved like men wielding axes to cut through the thick of the trees, etc. Down verse 10. How long will the enemy mock you, O God? Will the foe revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand, take it from the folds of your garment, destroy them? But you, O God, are my king from of old. You bring salvation upon the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave him as food to the creatures of the desert. Boy, he was in the sea and he was giving his food to the creatures in the desert. Keep that in mind. It was you who opened up the springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours, and yours also the night. You established the sun and the moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth, and you who made both summer and winter. So God is the creator of everything, and he destroyed some of his creation. Interesting passage. All right, so Psalm 104, 34. I just realized I need a self-turning Bible page now. Which verse? I'm sorry. 26. Yes, that was the other. I know, verse 34, I'm sure is a beautiful passage. But yes, we'll go to 24. So I'm going to start off at 19. Psalm 104, 19. The moon marks off the seasons. The sun knows when to go down. You bring darkness, it becomes night. All the beasts of the forest prowl. Beasts in the forest prowl. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. The sun rises and they steal away. They return and lie down to their dens. The man goes out to his work and his labor until evening. How many are your works, O Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There's the sea vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There are the ships that go to and fro, and the Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there. Those all look to you and give them their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they're satisfied with good things. When you hide your face, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. When you send your spirit, they are created and you renew the face of the earth. Interesting, but again, I want to emphasize God created every living thing. Among the living things seem to be three different witnesses to the idea of a Leviathan. There was Asaph in Psalms, there's David in Psalms. Actually, there are four because of Asaph in Psalms, excuse me. Then there was Isaiah, and then there's Job. So there are different witnesses to the idea of this creature that's a little hard for us to understand. To help us understand that, I want to now go to the behemoth, the aforementioned behemoth, in chapter 40 of Job. We'll start at verse 15. So this right before he's talking about the Leviathan, this will be in Job 40, 15. Look at the behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength he has in his loins, what power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways like cedar, the sinews of his thighs are close knit. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like rods of iron. He's strong, I'd say. He ranks first among the works of God, yet his maker can approach him with the sword. The hills bring him their produce. All the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plant, he lies hidden among the reeds in the marsh. The lotuses conceal him at their shadow. The poplars by the stream surround him. When the river rages, he's not alarmed. He's secure. Through the Jordan, though the Jordan should surge against his mouth, can anyone capture him by the eyes or trap him and pierce his nose? Okay, so when you read that, it sounds a lot like an elephant, maybe a mammoth, maybe a mastodon mammoth, prior elephant type dinosaur-ish creature deal. And that's my definition. But when you kind of break that down, you then see what strength he has in his loins, verse 16, what power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways, doesn't swell. His tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are close in. All right, so let's see. The tail sways like a cedar. What do we know about the tail of an elephant? Yes, it's dinky. It is the smallest component of an elephant that we could think about. We went down to an elephant preserve in the hill country of Texas, somewhere down there, last year, I think in June or something. When did we go there? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Anyway, but we've been there. And so we were able to actually go up and you can pet elephants, you can interact with them, you can observe the bottom of their foot as they shape their nails and whatever. It's a very fascinating experience to be next to this huge creature and so calm, so tame. And I couldn't help but notice the eyes were large. I mean, elephants are big. They're just huge creatures. And so the eye is, like really large. And then you work down, there's the huge back of the elephant, the legs, and then you get to the tail. And it says, really tiny little tail. And so I think it's interesting that this specifically mentions a tail swaying like a cedar. That would strike me that the tail would be like a large tree trunk. And when I think about the pictures I've seen in my prior studies and, childhood years, whatever, of dinosaurs, they seem to always have a very prominent tail. When in doubt, you can swing your tail around and whip another dinosaur out of the way and, win a fight, except against Triceratops, he had 3 horns. You'd always get plunged, those always get plunged in the belly and kill the big guy. So of all the dinosaurs, though, I think we see prominent tails being displayed. So I actually, for some reason or another, and probably just because I was a kid and it was interesting to me, I was always fascinated in dinosaurs, some degree or another. And they always talk we always talked about how some were plant feeders because they had nice little smooth teeth. And then there were those that were aggressive, you know, chase after you, roar so loud, it'd knock you down, they'd eat you up. And those are the carnivores. And they had these strangely, inexplicably tiny little front paws to where they couldn't pick you up and eat you, but they could sure grab you with their huge mouth, swing you around, kill you, swallow you whole. And so one of the things I liked about the dinosaurs was the brontosaurus. And the brontosaurus was this extremely huge, long, you know, 78 feet long. They had a neck that was, you know, probably 25 feet up in the air. It'd move around, touch a tree, get a leaf, eat a little tiny bit. Impossible to sustain 75 tons of food with a leaf here and there. But that didn't matter to me as a kid because I thought it was very cool how he could just peacefully sort of swing spot to spot and eat a little bit here and there and never seemingly have conflict. And he is huge, but fascinating. And I liked the name. I thought Brontosaurus was nice. So, yeah, exactly. Yeah, he actually ended up being gasoline that I have used. And so the ultimate recycling is I use the dinosaur I like to propel my car. So, but beyond all that, yeah, he is the image of the Sinclair Oil Company and others. So we all know him. And we all know that I copied something about him that I can't find right now because I'm looking for a long time for it. Let's see. Boy, between pictures of the grandkids and the puppies, man, here we go. All right, so in 1905, the American Museum of Natural History unveiled the first ever mounted skeleton of a sauropod, a composite specimen mainly made of bones from what was called AMNH 460, which is referred to as Brontosaurus excelsus, EXCELSUS, Brontosaurus excelsus. Now, my source here is actually a dinosaur museum. I want to make sure I give credit where it's due. And their source for this information actually is Wikipedia. So I will readily admit Wikipedia is concerning to some people because it can be edited and changed. So that's my disclosure on that. But the AMNH specimen was very complete, only missing feet, lower leg, shoulder bones, tailbone, neck, and head. Now, when I think about very complete, I suppose I would include feet, neck, head, tail, especially when picturing the length of this creature and, you know, knowing that it barely ate the top of a palm tree occasionally because it had this small mouth, little gentle, smooth teeth and was clearly an herbivore. However, that was missing from the specimen. To complete the specimen mount, the rest of the tail was fashioned to appear as Marsh, the discoverer, M-A-R-S-H was this Dr. Marsh who found it. Listen to this again. To complete the mount, the rest of the tail was fashioned to appear as Marsh believed it should, which had believing that it had too few vertebrae at the present. In addition, a sculpted model of what the museum felt the skull of the massive creature might look like was placed on the skeleton. This was not a delicate skull like that of Diplodocus, which would later turn out to be more accurate by other findings, but was based at the time on the, quote, the biggest, thickest, strongest skull bones, lower jaws, and tooth crowns from 3 different quarries of findings as a composite. These skulls were likely those of a different dinosaur, Camarasaurus, the only sauropod for which good skull material was found. So I think that is just, I'll stop there. There's a little more, but I think it's just a fascinating thing that our image of this dinosaur is really the image of a guy who found the dinosaur and put things together. And so it's a little difficult to base a lot of science on that, but I'll tell you what I think about it. And that is that first, I think that initially all large creatures, including behemoth, which, by the way, the name behemoth literally translates as beast of excellence. I like that name too. I think that's kind of cool to call a behemoth the beast of excellence. But, and I want to readdress in a minute behemoth and Leviathan, because I think they're of interest to talk about too. But going back again, I think that God did create large creatures. When I read the creation story, and he talks about the great creatures of the sea, and when he talks about the great creatures on the land, I think it makes logical sense that there were some beasts that we have trouble accounting for today, other than in, you know, fossil form or somebody's imagination or somebody putting together a fossil with imagination. And I think that they all ate plants because initially everything ate plants, as we read in Genesis 1:30 and 31, which I'll reread real quickly. Genesis 1:30, to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all creatures that move on the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so, and God saw that it was good. God saw what he had made, and it was very good. So I think they all ate plants initially. And I think the idea of a tooth being the indicator of whether some creature ate plant or ate meat is largely in the perspective of the discoverer, who maybe decided, I think this plant or this dinosaur ate a plant, or I think this one ate meat. Yes.
If by them all being plant eaters, that's how man and beast could coexist.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that after the flood, God then said at Genesis 6, for the sake of I'm sorry, not 6. For the sake of completeness, I'll read that one. And what she said for the sake of the tape was creatures and man could coexist because they all ate plants. They didn't eat each other. However, they turned on each other at Genesis 9. God blessed Noah and his son, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall upon all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So God clarified that for us. And that's when we started to have some more of the sort of hunter-gatherer mentality too. Yes?
And it's evidence that things can be big. We still have great, huge creatures in the deep sea.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we now look, and what she said was that there are still great, huge creatures in the sea. If you think about the whales that you see pictures of, some of the sharks, some of the, you know, some of the more standard fish are huge. You know, a tuna, those things, sturgeon, those things are big. You know, they're not little dinky. They're not like the goldfish in your little bowl, you know. And when we start looking at behemoth and leviathan, I think it is fair, in the interest of full disclosure, for me to mention that some people think that leviathan and behemoth are merely figurative. That if you look at Isaiah 27 and see where it says God will crush both heads of the leviathan and you know, take care of that beast that he's talking about through Isaiah, figuratively speaking, perhaps Egypt and Babylon, for instance, in terms of enemies of God's people. I think if you start looking at 4 different authors mentioning Leviathan, I think it's odd to me that none of them would say these nations are like a beast that we could call Leviathan that God would destroy. I think Leviathan was a beast they knew of, and they compared the way God was dealing with others with the way they had feared the beast. And then God would provide them deliverance. And so I think that's one bit of evidence. On the behemoth, and when you start looking at the description, and by the way, I should also mention, some people think the Leviathan of Job 41 sounds like a crocodile. I'm not really clear on where that comes from, but that's just something I've run across in reading about leviathans that some people think is a sort of a crocodile type creature. And then, of course, with behemoth, I could see why they would mention elephant or mammoth, because it talks about feeding on grass, being large like an ox. And then, you know, it just sounds like, in a sense, that that could be a large land walking creature like an elephant. But again, I'd say the tail like a cedar sounds kind of different. So I think that these do represent large creatures that were known in old times compared to us. And we talked about how we think Job was pretty old, whether really old or not, I don't know. But if we talk about the length of the earth in terms of scriptural time of when people came out of the Garden of Eden and then entered into a span of time where humans were alive and then died, which is described in Genesis after the departure from the Garden of Eden. If you add up all the possible dates, the best you can figure is somewhere around 6,000, 6,800 years BC. And so therefore a total of around, or excuse me, I'm sorry, 4,000 to 4,800, a total of 6,000, maybe 6,800 years now, possibly up to 10,000. It's a reasonable number to round off that the earth has been around somewhere around 7,000 to 10,000 years when you look at scriptural dates. And that's, you know, so-and-so gave birth to so-and-so and lived this many years, and etc. You know, all those various dates. All right, so having said all that, if we look at that length of time, and we look at, let's say Job was not way back at 5,000-ish BC, but let's put him at 3,000 BC, for instance, somewhere in that age frame, then we're talking about maybe a couple of thousand years since there was a large beast roaming the earth like a behemoth, possibly if it was killed in the flood and limited at that time in terms of length of life, or a large beast like Leviathan in the sea, that they would maybe still have tales of people, stories of people trying to deal with these large creatures from a couple of thousand years before. We have stories of people trying to deal with war, life, famine, flood, storm from a couple of thousand years ago. I don't think it's so odd that the people would be aware of those creatures. So now let's look at going back to Genesis 6. This is sort of a famous verse in many ways because people think about it in terms of length of human life. And I'll just, for the sake of context, let me actually read a couple of verses from chapter 5, verse 25. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became father of Lamech. After he became father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, he lived 969 years. So we always talk about Methuselah being the longest documented living individual at 969 years. So now, chapter 6, verse 3, the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. And so that many people view as the lifespan of people went from 900 plus years, as was shown in chapter 5, and a number of individuals, down to 120 years. How many of you know someone who has lived to be 120? No hands are showing, just for the sake of the tape. How many of you are 119 years old? You don't have to answer, actually, it's confidential. But anyway, I would suggest that when you look at this verse, if you say, oh, I'm not going to, God says my spirit won't continue with man, he's mortal, his days will be 120 years, that actually, I believe, is referring to the fact that because chapter 6, verse 1, men began to increase on the earth, and then verse 5, the Lord saw how great a man's wickedness on the earth had become. Every inclination of his thoughts and his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved they had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along ground and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then we know Noah went down to build the ark for 100 years. Now, I think that this verse, chapter 6, verse 3, means that in 120 years, I'm ending the lifespan of man, or the life of man, with the flood. That's open to debate. If you want to think that with me, I'm happy for you. If you don't want to, I'm happy for you. But when I look at verse 3, the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever. Sounds like he will contend with man for a while. For he is mortal, his days be 120 years. And then he goes down to say, I'm going to destroy man. And then he goes down and say, I found Noah who is righteous. And then he goes to Noah and says, build an ark because I'll destroy the earth. And then Noah built the ark and it took 100 years. And then the earth's destruction came. I think it makes sense. That's about 120 years from when God said, I am, the days will not last forever. It'll be 120 years from now, is my feeling on that. Now, when I look at that and see that when the flood came, people, everyone died except Noah and his family, as we know, and all the creatures and everything except those on the ark. And we discussed last week about Pangea, the one continent, being perhaps split by the raising up of waters from the springs of the earth, the pushing of continents, and the disruption of the one landmass of Eden that we read about earlier in Genesis. And we see that, when the ark had been in the water for 150 days, that God told them to come out. I think that disruption altered the earth enough by the balance of the earth and the rotation of the earth that people just didn't live as long, or years were different. I don't know which way I look at that, frankly. Because of that overwhelming force of the earth that pushed continents apart, built depth into the sea, built height into the mountains, and was the crushing effect of moving continents apart. And so when I then look at, like, for instance, over at chapter 10, verse 25, 2 sons were born to Eber. This is Genesis 10:25, if I didn't say that. 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided, and his brother's named Joktan. Well, you can look at that and see, well, the earth divided and, sent into different sections of the earth, perhaps. That may be division of the people, granted, like at the Tower of Babel. So let's look at that. Genesis 11. Okay, let's see. Oh, well, we are past time. That's a bummer. We just got started. So we'll do lesson next week. Yep. 7? 7 is a good number for the Lord, isn't it? So we'll do lesson 7 next week. I'm sorry, I didn't look at the clock here in a while. We will stop there. And next week, we'll talk about Tower of Babel, the division of the earth, my theory on how we got, say, indigenous people in North America, why there are people identified as Asian, African, European, Middle Eastern, North American, South American, how all that makes sense from a scriptural standpoint. And we'll do that next week. Thank you for listening so carefully. Yes. Yes. And I will mention one more time that, and I'm happy to discuss that after. But what he mentioned is I skipped over the sons of men married the, sons of God married the daughters of men in chapter 6. And because I addressed that in an entire episode of spiritual warfare study I did for an hour that is available online with the church website. Yeah, just an hour, because I did the short version. And so I'd be happy for you to either look at that from the church website link or discuss it later but we don't have time going all that with the class about creation.